Dear students, in this lesson we are going to talk about disaster and emergency planning for preparedness, response, and recovery, and the nurse's role in this issue. Nurses' role in disaster recovery is successful recovery preparation, health teaching, psychological support, referrals to hospital as needed, and remain alert for environmental health. What is an emergency planning? An emergency planning can be defined as the process of preparing systematically for future contingencies, including major incidents and disasters. The plan is usually a document shared between participants and stakeholders that specifies tasks and responsibilities adopted in the multi-agency response to the emergency that is going to happen. It should specify the alignments of action, collaboration, command, and communication during a civil contingency, such as a disaster or major event. In other words, it is the framework for emergency response. The maintenance of public safety, limitation of damage, protection of the vulnerable, and efficient use of life-saving resources are some of the goals of the plan. Although the end product is a document, emergency planning is more a process than an outcome, especially as the plan itself will need to be updated over time as circumstances change. The maintenance of public safety, limitation of damage, protection of the vulnerable, and efficient use of life-saving resources are some of the goals of the plan. The evolution of emergency and disaster planning. As we know it today, emergency planning for disasters derives from civil defense, a form of social organization designed to protect civilians against armed aggression. The latter, disaster planning, is a relatively new concept that in its modern form antedates the Second World War by only a very brief period. Although there had been rudimentary forms of organization for the protection of non-combatants in previous conflicts, for example, the American Civil War of the 1860s, the attack on Guernica in the Basque country of Spain on April 26, 1937 by German aircraft, was the first concerted aerial bombardment, and it killed 1,644 civilians, and the first occasion on which this had to be countered by properly organized measures of protection. So as you can see, the wars have started the idea of protecting the non-combatants starting from 1860s, and the concept matured in the First World War. It was a curtain raiser to the bombardments of the early 1940s, in which civil defense grew enormously, although largely without the benefits of fully codified plans. During this period, civil defense operatives were responsible for search and rescue, safeguarding and accommodating the survivors of bombing raids, ensuring public safety, and interdicting areas that had become unsafe. The rather temporary apogee reached by civil defense during the Second World War was subsequently followed by reorganization in order to face the demands of the Cold War, in which civilian life was overshadowed by the threat of a thermonuclear exchange between the great powers. And for those who doesn't know about anything about the Cold War, it is the era after the Second World War, where United States and USSR, the Soviet regime, formed a two-pole world where some of the countries were on the side of the Soviet regime and the others were on the side of the United States regime. And in this era, unfortunately, nuclear ballistic missiles were produced in so much numbers that they could destroy the whole world if they were to detonate on the world. And this lasted until the 1990s, and after which the Soviet Union was dispersed, and now the Berlin Wall went down, and now we have this, today we don't have this Cold War era on the world. So during this period, the Cold War period, plans were usually kept secret because there were too many espionage, spying on anything that could be beneficial to the either side, and were predicted on the assumption that citizens could be protected and given shelter against nuclear blasts and radioactive fallout. The Tente and the dissolution of the Eastern Bloc led to the gradual end of the era of civil defense and slow rise of civil protection, which is designed to protect people against the effects of natural, technological, and societal hazards. In its purest form, civil defense is a service provided by the central state and directed at the national level, which means it is fundamentally from top to down. But civil protection is a decentralized service, which means it comes from bottom to up, in which the basis of organization is local, which usually means that it is centered on the municipal level. Emergency planning is a relatively young field that began to develop systematically in the 1970s, coincidentally with the rise of civil protection. Initially, it did so largely in response to technological hazards, such as toxic spills and industrial explosions. Later, there was increasing emphasis on natural disasters, such as floods, storms, and earthquakes. Most civil contingencies are small enough to be resolved adequately without qualitative changes in daily management procedures or quantitative changes in the availability of resources. There is no consistently reliable way of distinguishing between major incidents, disasters, and catastrophes. Nevertheless, all of these events have in common the fact that they must be resolved by the suspension of normal procedures and substitution of emergency ones. In catastrophes, the imperatives, tasks, and relationships between participants are sufficiently exceptional to require substantial organization and working methods that differ from those employed in workday routines. Emergency response involves a mixture of plans, procedures, and improvisation. To some extent, improvisation is inevitable, but it needs to be limited by preparedness. It is axiomatic that planning and procedures should not be improvised during an emergency when they should have been thought through and created beforehand. The consequence of unwanted improvisation is inefficiency emergency response, which may have serious or tragic consequences. A degree of uniqueness present in each new disaster means that improvisation cannot be avoided, but foresight and preparedness can constrain it to a necessary minimum. Now here I would like to give you an example. The same area, the same city, the same part of a country may be experiencing two consecutive earthquakes. And in the first earthquake, people are able to put forward everything that they were prepared for, but some things may still be lacking in the preparedness plan. So the responsible people there should act in a way that thinking about their experiences and improvising the procedures to help people. However, when you add these experiences gained from these improvisations to the preparedness plan for the next time, and another earthquake hits the area, which brings forward new consequences, everything that was written from the previous improvisations cannot be enough again to solve the problem, but brings you more experience. And again, you will have to make some improvisations in the next disaster as well. But being prepared and adding each experience to the preparedness plan brings the improvisation to a less limit. So that is why the improvisation is always not a wanted case method of action, but has to be used. Moreover, emergencies are always occasions for learning, and a significant part of the body of experience on which plans are based comes from the mistakes, inefficiencies, and improvisations of the past. An emergency plan should not have to teach a fireman how to put out a fire, or the police how to direct the traffic, because they do know how to do their job. That's why they're firemen, or that is why they're policemen, or that is why they're nurses or doctors, etc. But instead it should articulate and integrate the procedures to be used in a major emergency by assigning responsibilities and ensuring that all personnel involved in complex field operations understand both their own roles and those of other participants. So this brings forward what we call collaboration. Thus, one can make an analogy between the emergency response and the symphony. Individual instrumentalists have their own music, like the procedures, while the conductor has the score, like the plan. The common objective is to work in harmony, like each instrument playing its own part, but in the end bringing out a beautiful symphony. Let us explain what disaster is. According to Pan American Health Organization, PAHO, a disaster can be defined as an overwhelming ecological disruption which exceeds the capacity of a community to adjust and consequently requires assistance from outside. Now let's take a look at the classification of disasters. There are two major disasters that we encounter today in our everyday life. The first ones are the natural disasters, and the second one, unfortunately, are the man-made disasters. If we look at the natural disasters, if we have to give some examples with this, we have meteorological disasters like the storms, cold spells, heat waves, droughts. We have typological disasters like landslides, avalanches, mud flows and floods. We have telluric and tectonic disasters, like disaster originating from underground, like the earthquakes. And we may have biological disasters, like contagious diseases, as the one we are experiencing today in 21st century, the coronavirus pandemic, and animal diseases, etc. Now, when we look at the man-made disasters, the second topic of the classification, we can see at the first place is the warfare, the shame on the humankind. And warfare can be conventional and non-conventional warfare. And for those who may not know anything about what non-conventional warfare is, the conventional war is the war that is fought in the field and with guns and etc. But non-conventional warfare may include the ballistic missiles, where people sit at a corner in the world and press a button and sends nuclear headed missiles, ballistic missiles from one continent to another, or they may be running heavy embargoes to other nationalities and keep them from doing their trade with other countries and forcing them to surrender to things. And there are many kinds of non-conventional warfare, and they're not to the benefit of the humankind. We may have civil disasters. We may be experiencing some accidents, transportation, structural collapse, explosions and fires, and we may have some technological failures. In this table, we can see the major natural disasters and minor natural disasters, together with the major man-made disasters and minor man-made disasters. Among major natural disasters, we can see that we have flood, cyclone, drought, earthquake, volcano eruptions, and among minor natural disasters, we can have cold waves, thunderstorms, mudslides, landslides, and storms. If we look at the major man-made disasters, we can see that there are settings of fire, like the one we experienced last year in Australia. Almost whole of the continent were under fire. We can have epidemics. We can have deforestation, and which is quite a big issue for today's world, deforestation. And if we can remember that our lungs for our earth are the forests, deforestation will be bringing too much burden on our planet for sure. We have chemical pollution, and unfortunately the United States has not signed the Treaty of Kyoto for not polluting the earth, and some countries did. But chemical pollution is one of the major issues today in terms of polluting our planet. And unfortunately, we have wars, any kind of war between the nationalities. There are some minor man-made disasters as well, like the road, naval, air, or train accidents. There might be some food poisonings, which may be on large scales on local areas. Industrial disasters, explosion of some factories, etc. And we may have experiencing environmental pollution, which is also the human beings, for which the human beings are responsible of mostly. If we look at the levels of disasters, there are 3 levels for disaster description, and it goes from 3 to 1, 3 being the lightest and 1 being the strongest disaster. Level 3 disasters, they are considered a minor disaster. These involve a minimal level of damage. Level 2 disasters are moderate disasters. The local and community resources has to be mobilized to manage the situation. And we have level 1 disasters. They are considered a massive disaster. This involves a massive level of damage with severe impact. Now let us take a look at the aims of disaster preparedness. It refers to measures taken to prepare for and reduce the effects of disasters. Disaster preparedness is a continuous and integrated process. And if we look at the objectives of disaster preparedness, increasing the efficiency, effectiveness, and impact of disaster emergency response mechanisms at the community, national, and federation levels, depending on the level of the disasters happening, level 1, level 2, or level 3 disasters. The second objective is to strengthening community-based disaster preparedness and developing activities that are useful for both addressing everyday risks that communities face and for responding to disaster situations. If we look at the disaster preparedness strategy, on the first place, we put the hazard, risk, and vulnerability assessment. Then we go to response mechanisms and strategies, and then preparedness plans are made. Then we form the coordination, the information management, early warning systems, resource mobilization, public education and rehearsals, and community-based disaster preparedness. Disaster preparedness strategy identify the characteristics, frequency, and potential severity of the hazards a community faces. It identifies the particular geographical areas and communities that are most susceptible and vulnerable to those hazards. It identifies the main sectors of a community, population, infrastructure, housing, services, etc., that would be affected by a specific type of hazard and anticipate how they might be affected. It assesses the ability of those sectors to withstand and cope with the effects of hazardous phenomena. And what about response mechanisms and strategies? They should be getting ready for evacuation procedures. They should be able to do search and rescue teams, form search and rescue teams to perform search and rescue, including plans for training them. Assessment teams, including plans for training them. Procedures for activating distribution systems, preparations for emergency reception centers and shelters, procedures for activating emergency programs for airports, harbors, and land transport. Preparedness planning. Disaster preparedness planning involves identifying organizational resources, determining roles and responsibilities, developing policies and procedures, and planning preparedness activities aimed at ensuring timely disaster preparation and effective emergency response. Because unless the response is given at a certain time, it would be useless. The coordination involves the organizations like the civil defense and government emergency structures, fire brigades, health departments and clinics, Red Crescent or Red Cross societies, military help, and international agencies. Information management includes disaster preparedness and response depend on gathering, analyzing, and acting on timely and accurate information before hazard and early warning information, during disaster needs assessment, and after disaster, progress post-disaster recovery. So information management should be before, if we have some especially early warning systems. Information should take into consideration the data coming from the early warning systems and distribute the news to the public or to the necessary organizations like the municipality or the national security, etc. And it is also important to be in communication during the hazard and, of course, after the hazard has taken place. And what about early warning systems? The purpose of early warning systems is to detect, forecast, and when necessary, issue alerts related to impending hazard events. Early warning information comes from a number of sources like meteorological offices, ministries of health, for example, disease outbreaks, and agriculture, for example, for crop forecasts, local and indigenous sources, media sources, and internet early warning services. What is resource mobilization then? National societies should develop strategies, agreements, and procedures for mobilizing and acquiring emergency funds, supplies, and equipment in the event of a disaster, because local resources may not be enough depending on the scale of the disaster that has happened. So some resources should be mobilized from the national level. This must be coordinated. A preparedness plan should spell out the policies for acquisition and disbursement of funds, use of outside equipment and services, and emergency funding strategies. When we look at the public education, training and rehearsals, public education campaigns should be done, training of response teams and rehearsals of emergency response scenarios, and public rehearsals should be included as much as possible. Otherwise, we cannot rely on the experience of the helping people only, but as the community, we must be prepared for disasters as well. The community-based disaster preparedness requires the local populations in disaster-stricken areas are the first to respond to a disaster. They're usually involved in search and rescue activities as well as in providing emergency treatment and relief to their families, friends, and neighbors. So the local communities can take place in a disaster, but only at a limited level. Well, you can see here that when an incident happens, as soon as the incident happens, the community will have a response to it. And with that response, we aim to recover the adversaries of the incident. And once recovery starts, we aim to mitigate the adversaries that the incident has caused. And with after these are passed, then we get prepared for the next disaster, keeping in mind the gaps that we had in our response to the disaster, and putting them into our plans for the next disaster. We get prepared for the next and wait for another incident. So it's like a circle going on and on. Of course, in not in days, in weeks, but it tens or hundreds of years time. So what are the aims of disaster plans that we make? They're to provide prompt and effective medical care to the maximum possible in order to minimize morbidity. Morbidity means permanent injuries coming to the body of a person, and mortality, which means death. And objectives of disaster plans are to optimally prepare the staff and institutional resources for effective performances in disaster situation, and to make the community aware of the sequential steps that could be taken at individual and organizational levels. And when we talk about readiness for disasters, it is the resource for readiness and disaster prep planning. And the resource for readiness includes the Red Crescent, the Red Cross, the community and local government, and civil defense services. And disaster pre-planning includes hospital disaster planning, evacuation, orderly flow of casualty, and communication system. Now, in large-scale adversaries, in large-scale disasters, when the number of casualties is too much for the number of medical helping personnel, outnumbers the health personnel, there is a system called triage to help the people on the field. And this is not an easy job. It is not an easy task to perform. You cannot spend more than a minute for a patient on the field, and you have to decide which one is to be treated emergently or which one can wait on the field until the other health caregivers arrive. Which one is to be mobilized first to a more sophisticated health building, etc. Now, triage is the process of determining the priority of patients' treatments by the severity of their condition or likelihood of recovery with and without treatment. That's very important. This rations patients' treatment efficiently when rescue resources are insufficient for all to be treated immediately, influencing the order and priority of emergency treatment, emergency transport, or transport destination for the patient. The term comes from the French verb trier, meaning to separate, to sort, to shift, or to select. Modern medical triage was invented by Dominique Jean Larrey, a surgeon during the Napoleonic Wars, who treated the wounded according to the observed gravity of their injuries and the urgency for medical care, regardless of their rank or nationality. Those responsible for the removal of the wounded from a battlefield or their care afterwards would divide the victims into three categories. Those who are likely to live regardless of what care they receive. Those who are unlikely to live regardless of what care they receive. And those for whom immediate care may make a positive difference in outcome. This was the triage principle at those times. If we look at the objectives of triage, we see that it is for ensuring immediate medical intervention in the life-threatening situations, to expedite the care of patients through a systematic initial assessment, to ensure that patients are prioritized for treatment in accordance with the severity of their medical condition, and reduce morbidity through early medication intervention. It also aims to improve public relations by communicating appropriate information to friends and relatives who accompany patients, to improve patients' flow within emergency departments and/or disaster management situation, and provide supervised learning for appropriate personnel. Now, principles of triage are very important. Every patient should be received and triaged by appropriately skilled healthcare professionals. Triage is a clinic managerial decision and must involve collaborative planning. The triage process should not cause a delay in the delivery of effective clinical care. One of the frequently used triage methodologies in today's applications is the START triage and color coding. START stands for Simple Triage and Rapid Treatment. It is a simple triage system that can be performed by lightly trained lay and emergency personnel in emergencies. It has been field proven in mass casualty incidents such as train wrecks and bus accidents, though it was developed by community emergency response teams and firefighters after earthquakes. Triage separates the injured into 4 groups, and this is valid for today's applications. The expectant, who are beyond help. The injured, who can be helped by immediate transportation. The injured whose transport can be delayed. Those with minor injuries who need help less urgently. Now we have some color codings for this START type of triage. Triage also set priorities for evacuation and transport as follows. The black color stands for the diseased and are left where they fell. Deceased people are not dealt with in triage, because if you spend time for the dead people, you may miss the chance of dealing with the problems of more emergent people, victim. The black tag or the black color is chosen for the dead people in a disaster for triage purposes. These include those who aren't breathing and repositioning their airway efforts were unsuccessful. So you just spend only a minute for that person. If it's not breathing, if it's not repositioning himself or herself, try to breathe, then it's accepted as dead and left where it has fell. The red coding means immediate or a priority 1 person's victims, for which evacuation by medevac if available or ambulance as they need advanced medical care at once or within 1 hour. These people are in critical condition and would die without immediate assistance. The yellow color is used for delayed or priority 2 victims. They can have their medical evacuation delayed until all immediate people have been transported, which means all the person with the red tag is transported. These people are in stable condition, but they require medical assistance. And what has to be very importantly said here, that people who were initially tagged with a yellow band or a yellow tag, may deteriorate and become a priority one victims while they wait for the others to be transported. So someone has to keep an eye on the priority two people, victims on the field. And the green tag, or the minor or priority three victims, they are not evacuated until all immediate and delayed persons have been evacuated. These will not need advanced medical care for at least several hours. Continue to re-triage in case their condition worsens. So the same rule applies to the green tagged victims as well. As time goes by, they may become priority 2 patients, or they may become priority 1 victims. Consider at the first time when you see a patient, it may have an internal bleeding, but it's not very obvious at the first moments of the disaster. But as time goes by, the patient will be bleeding more and more, and after maybe 2 hours or 3 hours time, the amount of bleeding will be that much to compromise his life. So if that kind of patient with his an awake, a talking oriented patient is tagged as green in the first place, he or she might be getting to the yellow or the red situation as time goes by. So re-triage in these cases are very important to evaluate the victims of a disaster. So these people are able to walk and may only need bandages and antiseptics usually in the green or minor or priority 3 group. Areas. Now we can see some samples of triage tags here. You can see that there are colors black, red, yellow, and green. So these can be put to the wrists of the patients, or this may be, well, in some disasters, the people may be losing their extremities, so these may be put over the head of the injured people depending on their situation. We use the black for the dead and we leave them where they are. We use the green for minorly injured people who do not need emergency care, and we use the red for delayed seriousness, so that we know that they will be dealt with as soon as the mostly emergent ones are dealt with and moved away from the disaster area. So these may be extremity tags, these might be head tags, neck tags, and you can use different things to tag the patients on the disaster plane. And disaster drills. The disaster drills are in fact very, very important actions to be taken during normal life, and to educate the public and to educate the caregivers in terms of their coordination, and increase the speed of response. A disaster drill is an exercise in which people simulate the circumstances of a disaster so that they have an opportunity to practice their responses. It helps to identify weak points in a disaster or response plan. It facilitates people getting familiar with the steps they need to take so that their response in a disaster will be automatic. They must be reconducted in a timely intervals necessitated by this simulated disaster. And now let us take a look at the nurse's role in disaster preparedness. 1. To facilitate preparation with community. 2, to provide updated record of vulnerable populations within community in order to be able to reach them afterwards. 3, nurses lead a preparedness effort. 4, nurses play multi-roles in community. 5, nurses should have understanding of community resources. So, take part in community assessment, case finding and referring, prevention, health education, and surveillance are very important roles that nurses would take in a disaster. Nurses act promptly for immediate plans for triage to begin, and triage is very important to be done with trained personnel. Work as a member of assessment team, and they are involved in ongoing surveillance.